Star Wars is one of the quintessential media franchises in history, with everything you'd want. Space battles, space politics, space weapons. But what is the most alluring aspect of the world? That's right, it's the Force. It's the ability to move things with your mind, control people, move fast, jump higher. As a child, and I must admit, even now as an adult, I have often wondered what it would be like to have this ability. Even today, as I enter somewhere with those automatic doors, I often do a little motion as if I'm opening the doors with the Force. And that left me to wonder, what if the Force were actually real? How would such a thing play out in human history? To be clear, nothing else about the Star Wars universe will be inserted into real history, we will only look at the Force. Of course, this video can also not follow a clear timeline with nations and map changes, but will instead give a broader overview of how human society might develop differently. Now first, we need to quickly discuss what even is the Force. Here, I could start by alienating 50% of the audience by talking about midichlorians, but let's not open that can of worms. The important part is that a select number of people are Force sensitive for whatever reason, allowing them to influence the world around them. Their powers are varied, but include pulling and pushing stuff, running really fast, jumping real high, fighting from the high ground, and many other abilities. Adding to this, and this will become important, Force sensitivity, at least to some extent, is hereditary, as powerful Force users tend to produce other powerful Force users. Also, as a quick note, while in Star Wars many species can be Force sensitive, we will only give it to humans, as they are the only sentient species. Sorry, but we aren't discussing Force-sensitive pigs. With that, we can dive into the scenario, as we discuss the hunter-gatherers. Here, not too much has yet changed. The Force is still underdeveloped, there isn't the time for people to train, make it an art, develop new skills, write them down, etc. etc. Force users would still be very useful and would likely become leading types in most tribes. They have heightened reflexes, they can run faster, and they might be able to force throw a spear. All very useful abilities. Yet, for the most part, things wouldn't be too different yet, as Force skills are still restricted to the very basics. The real changes only start happening around the development of agriculture, but really accelerate around the development of cities and civilizations. At this point, Force users have become something we as humans must come to terms with. Obviously, religion is the biggest question of such an alternate history, as every culture has to come to terms with the existence of the Force. Now, the explanation for why the Force exists isn't actually that difficult for most. The people simply wouldn't know any better. It was just a part of the creation of their founding figure. The Force existing would be just as natural as gravity. People don't need to know how it works in order to accept that it works. The real philosophic and religious question is, why only certain people? Here, I might offer a couple of possibilities. In extreme cultures, perhaps ones where Force users have gone on a rampage, the Force could become seen as a sin, an unnatural development that goes against what God intended, attempting to hunt Force users into extinction. These cultures would be the minority though, as I imagine most follow the route of Force users being a representation of the divine. The Force itself might become seen as a god itself, while Force users take the role of angels and heroes we know from mythology. The best way to explain living in this world would be to imagine living in the world of mythical Greece, as it becomes completely normalized that you are living with demigods who are doing all sorts of crazy things. In most cultures, Force users would become recognized as somehow better than regular humans, especially as the increasing food surplus allows Force users to start specializing, honing their craft, and improving the capabilities of what the Force can do. We would finally get beyond the very basic Force skills, as the first sects and organizations would be dedicated to learning and improving the skill. Force users evolve from pro athletes to gods amongst men. Skills are learned and written down. Force users learn how to alter people's mind, shoot electricity from their fingers, create Force barriers, and all the other skills we've seen Force users use in the movies. This development would take place over the course of thousands of years, but slowly but steadily, Force users as a class become more and more powerful. This is where we discuss the Jedi-Sith dichotomy within the Star Wars world. I don't imagine this becoming a thing, at least in these early stages, as most would simply see the Force as a whole and most Force users would be grey. The idea that there are dark side and light side powers can definitely develop later on, but this would likely take a long time. If you are being honest here, most Force users would simply be your average human, mentally speaking. And would you, without any knowledge of the Jedi, restrict yourself to just light side powers, only using your powers for good? I will admit, I wouldn't. Now, historically speaking, humans can be easily described as power hungry. And in that context, we are entering the age of Force Lords. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now, developing from their position as religious leaders, the first bold Force users would start fighting against each other for more control, as it becomes a race to the top. The development and usage of Force abilities would be like an arms race in the early centuries. The moment that the first powerful Force users take up an army and attempt to crush their opposition, that's when the others have to as well, or risk getting crushed. Complete massacres of Force users would become commonplace, as once you establish your position as Force Emperor, most normal humans don't stand a chance to oppose you. We've seen Force users wipe out entire clone and droid armies in Star Wars. Now imagine how well some dudes with bow and arrows would perform. And considering how, especially in these early millennia, armies are insanely expensive, what even is the point in having a huge army? You are better off having a specialized Force division for fighting with minor normal armies for occupation and peacekeeping. As Force Lords become established, a new hierarchy develops, where there is usually a single figure on the top, the Emperor or the King. They then have a small inner circle who are allowed to be Force sensitive, but any sane ruler will still tightly control Force education to ensure that nobody can rival his strength. The lower class then would slowly be squeezed for Force sensitivity. There is no benefit for the elites to have Force sensitive farmers running around, as most lower classes will have to hide their Force abilities or face persecution or abduction. In most cultures, the Force would be monopolized by the elites. Force users for the lower class will likely become comparable to witches in Western stories, famed for their healing abilities and minor magic tricks, but nothing compared to the true, raw power of the Force that the elites use to fight each other. In terms of government, divine justified hereditary monarchies would become even more commonplace. Royal families would very much attempt to breed the most powerful Force Lords and keep knowledge and talent of the Force within their own control. Controlling Force sensitivity, and especially the learning institutes that develop this skill, become the two most important keys to power in this alternate timeline. But it is important to note that there would be exceptions. There would be plenty of sects, especially in remote regions, that focus on the Force purely as an art or a religion, rather than using it to increase their power and wealth. For example, I could imagine that the parallel to the monks in the Himalayas would be amongst the most powerful Force users on Earth, secluding themselves from most of the rest of the world to develop what I would imagine mostly light side Force powers. Their seclusion would make them famed throughout the world, and across Asia, I imagine Force users will travel in droves in hopes of being taken under the wing of a monk and learning their ancient wisdoms. But precisely because these sects will likely be isolated, they are very much the exception and not the norm, as the rest of the world are ruled by power-hungry Force users. Now at this point, we need to consider the sheer scale of some Force powers. Obviously, Star Wars takes place on a universal level, and several Force powers have the potential to simply wipe out the entire world, or much of it. For example, Darth Bane used a Thought Bomb, an ability that simply destroys all Force-sensitive users in an area. Imagine how useful that would be for a Force Lord hoping to hold onto power. Or Darth Nihilus, who who once managed to drain the life force from an entire planet. Considering that we only have one of those, that could quickly become an issue. There is also the Force Storm, an ability which basically creates a force wormhole that destroys an entire planet. Should any of these abilities be developed, whether by accident or on purpose, life on Earth could easily be wiped out, as the destructive force of the Force makes our nuclear weapons look like mere playthings for children. But let's move back to history and move forwards a little bit. Obviously, I cannot predict any states in this alternate timeline, nor the culture or religion fully, but we can still ponder a little bit about government forms. Let's, for example, imagine something akin to our timeline's feudalism, the political system where you have a ruler on the top who lends out territory to others to control in their name. But now, instead of nobles simply being normal people born into the position, their position is determined and secured by the fact that they are force users. Again, assuming that force sensitivity is hereditary, these timelines could quickly turn into dystopias. What purpose are non-force users to force users, but as cattle? Normal humans have no hope to ever stand up to the elites and are kept solely because they are useful to plow the fields and make stuff for the elites to consume. Within this political system, strategic marriages are different as well, as we would see many force-bred dynasties popping up, with powerful force users marrying other powerful force users to create the most powerful force children. Imagine that rather than a dynasty simply being prestigious, like marrying a Habsburg is just really cool, you'd have a dynasty like the Skywalkers being wooed by everyone, begging to marry a son or a daughter in order to strengthen their dynasty. Here, I want to quickly mention the concept of powerful women. Force sensitivity seems to not discriminate between male and female. This can have many consequences for many cultures. In some, it could lead to much earlier equality between men and women, especially within the force-using elites. In others though, women could be forced to suppress their force ability, in a similar way that normal education was kept out of their reach for so long. Of course, this is not a question that I have an easy answer to, as this will be different from culture to culture. We then might imagine an alternate enlightenment. Again, this is a mere thought experiment, as by no means are we ever guaranteed to reach a similar political or philosophical point in this alternate timeline. Still, if we do, we now encounter a real issue. Fundamentally speaking, there is absolutely no difference between me and the King of the Netherlands, except that he was lucky enough to be born into a family that 4 centuries ago helped kick the Spanish out. The case is easily made that there should be no different treatment between the king, nobles, and normal people like me. This is far from the case in this alternate timeline. Would an ideology proposing equality ever even develop in a world where pretty much objectively there is a group of people better than the rest? Privilege is no longer just an expression of birth or even wealth. Force users are just very clearly, whether for religious or simply power reasons, better than normal people. For most, the idea of questioning this wouldn't even come up. Now what I could see happening, though it is pretty crazy, is the concept of what we consider to be the Jedi Order to develop as a result of an alternate Enlightenment type movement. Rather than focusing on liberty and the reducing of noble privileges, the emphasis could now be placed on the reduction of corruption and the power-seeking behavior of force users. The focus could lay on treating normal people well, on the duty that force users have in defending peace and order rather than advancing their own interest. It wouldn't quite be the Jedi Order, though it might develop into something like it over centuries, but the idea of such a top-down movement from force users to tame their own power and destruction, I could very much see happening. At this stage, a more clear distinction between dark and light side powers and users would develop, as the Force becomes far more exclusionary. This could then develop into more rights for the non-Force users. In this, I actually quite like the Star Wars system, where the Force users are banded together in a cult which is basically above the democracy, even if not officially, while the normal people are still free to rule themselves without direct intervention and steering from the Force users. Now, moving away from the political a bit, let's discuss potential ramifications of the Force on technological progress. Technology would be far, far behind our own timeline. For the most part, innovation is driven not just by talent and capacity, but also by a certain push for utility. For example, the Inca society was very well aware of wheels and axes. They used them to make children's toys. Yet, they never used them for transportation. Why might this be? Well, a possible explanation is that in their mountainous environment, they tried it and it wasn't that useful, as losing your grip for a second will send a cart flying down the mountain. What we see as a crucial technology, they simply decided wasn't worth or useful for them, despite being very capable of developing it. The inclusion of the Force into humanity's repertoire would, from the perspective of Force users, make many inventions unnecessary. Considering that these Force users would be the elites in most societies, this is quite a damper on progress. Why develop a crane if a Force user can just move a boulder with no effort? Why develop irrigation if a Force user can just bend the water onto your crops? Of course, normal people can and will develop these types of things at some point, but there is far less of an immediate need to. Getting to the technology level of Star Wars, starting from our starting point, would take far, far longer to get to. And the field where this is best seen in is the development of military technology. Anything humans can come up with within the first 95% of our existence is completely pointless in the face of just your average Force user. Considering armies as we know them are likely not even a thing, innovation in the field of military is very, very slow. That is, from the perspective of the elites. There is, however, a distinct possibility that normal people are very interested in military development. After all, this is the only way that they can level the playing field with Force users, which for many could be a very interesting incentive to innovate. If an anti-Force resistance movement rises up, I can think of a couple of inventions which might be somewhat effective on Force users. First is gunpowder. This is pretty much mandatory, as arrows are never going to cut it, as they are just too slow, bulky and easy to stop. Gunpowder and explosives would become the best weapons against Force users. And here, an invention like the Korean Hwacha would be great to combat Force users with, as it can fire off hundreds of rocket power arrows at once. Build a couple of these, fire them all at once, and good luck blocking all of the attacks. Another weapon proving to be deadly to Jedi in the Star Wars universe is basically a shotgun, which the Mandalorians used to great effect. It is quite simple maths: more bullets, larger area, more difficult to block. Gatling guns too could be devastating, forcing Force users to continually block a barrage of fast bullets. Of course, capable Force users will hardly struggle with these, but they are a good start. Of course, these types of developments would have to contend with the fact that the Force elites would very much want to destroy and hinder their progress. Now, a final possibility that I want to discuss, which I have seen suggested, is that the existence of Force users this early on would mean normal people become extinct. Now, this mainly depends on the degree of hereditariness of the Force, and I very much invite Star Wars fans to discredit this part of the video. But assuming a decent degree of hereditariness across tens of thousands of years of human history, it is absolutely a decent possibility that Force users, likely the preferred mates to both sexes, simply outcompete normal humans. They wouldn't quite go extinct, but Force users are the standard and non-Force users would be the minority in such a timeline. There is, however, as far as I know, not enough evidence from the Star Wars universe, besides the Skywalker family, that the Force is hereditary to this extent. Still, very much consider it a possibility. With that though, I think I've just about said everything I wanted to say. If you think I've missed something, and I'm sure I have missed a bunch, let me know in the comments. For now, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click on the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.